If you have any trouble authenticating to your server, triple check your username and your password. So our Apollo server requires two different parameters to run. The first one is the type defs, which is your GraphQL type definitions. So what are the actual GraphQL types? What are the GraphQL queries? Things like that. And then our resolvers, which is how do we resolve queries / mutations, which are the two main ways to interact with your Apollo server. And so we can create this Apollo server by saying const server is equal to the Apollo server constructor, and it's going to take in two parameters. It's going to take in the type defs, and then it's going to take in the resolvers. The type defs and resolvers are something we are going to create later in this video, but they're going to exist in these folders. Const type defs is equal to require, and we can say in this directory, go to the GraphQL folder, which we're going to make, and then go to the type defs file we're going to create. Then we can also point to where our resolvers are going to live eventually, and we can do that by saying require / which means this directory, GraphQL again, / resolvers. And just so you guys get some context, the main chunk of our code is going to exist in the type defs and resolvers files. So that's why we're pointing this Apollo server to kind of start from these files. We also want our Apollo server to interact with things using Mongoose. So we have to do a mongoose.connect. We're going to pass in our MongoDB URI string, which is this string right here, which is saying connect to this database specifically. And then this is just some code, this is some documentation, but use new URL parser is true. And then we can say .then, so when the connection is done, we can do a little arrow function syntax here to create some code to show when the connection is done. We can say console.log MongoDB connection successful. And then we can return a server.listen on, let's say, port 5000 for our server here. When our Mongoose is successfully connected, we then want our Apollo server to start. I'll explain more of the Mongoose stuff later as it makes more sense in actual practice, but pretty much we want Mongoose to be connected first because our Apollo server needs to use Mongoose to talk to MongoDB. We can then do another .then statement because this return server.listen is going to give us a response right here, or result, sorry. And so with this result, we can show where the server is actually running. So we can say backticks server is running at $res.url. This is pretty much using the response from the return server.listen, and the backticks allow us to do this $sign syntax to use a variable inside of our string. This is just to show that we are actually running a server at localhost 5000, for example, so this res.url is going to become. So this is great news. This means that we have our Apollo server getting started and our Mongoose getting successfully connected. If we try to run our code right now, you're going to see that type defs and resolvers are both undefined. I'm going to define these in a second, but I think it's important to first look at what does a Mongoose model actually look like. So let's go into our directory here and make a folder called models. This is where our Mongoose model is going to live. So we're going to make a model for the recipe. We call it recipe. The creation of the Mongoose models is relatively simple. We're going to get the model and schema out of our Mongoose package here. We're going to require Mongoose. This gives us access to both the Mongoose model and the Mongoose. So if we want to make a schema for recipe, we can say recipe schema is equal to new schema constructor. And then we can pass in any of the properties we expect to have in the recipe schema. So for example, the name is going to be a string type. The description is also going to be a string. The created at is going to be a string. So like created at a certain date, for example. We're going to have thumbs up, which we're expecting to be a number, and also thumbs down, which we're expecting to be a number as well. This is a basic idea of what a schema would look like for a recipe, but for whatever you're doing, you can always look up Mongoose schema properties, and it will show you all the different things like strings and numbers, and you can get a bunch of great examples to base your own, maybe different model off of. But for this tutorial, we are good to go with this recipe schema. We can then do a module.exports to pretty much send data out of this file if we ever want to use recipe.js. We are going to export the model constructor with a name of recipe, and then the actual schema of the model, which is going to be the recipe schema. And so now we are fully set up on the Mongoose side. We have a Mongoose model, which we can then use to save data to our MongoDB database. So if we go back to our index.js, we have this type defs and resolvers, which I kind of went over before. So let's create this GraphQL folder and make the type defs and resolvers. So we can go to the new folder here, we can say GraphQL, and let's start by creating the type defs. .js. So type defs are pretty much saying what are the GraphQL types we're expecting to have in our Apollo server. So type defs is more of a GraphQL concept that Apollo server uses. And type defs are created by using this thing called GQL, or the graph querying language. So we can import GQL by saying const GQL is equal to require Apollo server. So from here, we want to say module.exports is equal to GQL and then backticks. Anything in between these backticks is going to be looked at as GQL code. We're not in JavaScript land anymore. We're actually being kind of rendered as graph querying language, if that makes sense. And so we can get started by creating our first GraphQL type. We can start by saying type recipe is then going to have the property of a string with the name. The description's also going to be a string. The created at is also going to be a string. Thumbs up is going to be an integer. The integer here is a subtle difference. In our mongoose model, we save it as number, but in GraphQL, it's expected to use something like integer, for example. So that's another strange thing about working with mongoose models and then the actual GraphQL types is sometimes the names aren't one-to-one the same. You have to be kind of creative, kind of going back and forth between them. Then we can make the thumbs down also be an int. And so this is great. We have our first GraphQL type. And this GraphQL type is important because it allows us to do things like have a GraphQL